Thank you. There were no prior warnings. That's what the official story said. Well, in fact, there were warnings of impending attacks from at least 11 other nations. Just Google 9/11 warnings and you'll see them all. They came from everywhere. Germany, from Russia, from just everywhere. On top of that, insiders such as John Ashcroft and San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown were warned not to fly prior to 9/11. According to Richard Clark and George Tenet, the system was blinking red in the days leading up to the so-called attacks, but the Bush White House was not keen on doing anything about it. Unidentified insiders made millions of dollars on the stocks of American Airlines and United Airlines by placing put options made just prior to 9/11. And the stocks, betting that the stocks would plummet on or around 9/11. The New York Stock Exchange is unwilling to give out the names of those who profited, citing privacy concerns. But what's more important, the privacy of those who deal on the New York Stock Exchange or finding out who knew what about it? There were no prior warnings for this act of terrorism. Well, the White House took advantage of this so-called act of terrorism just prior to 9/11. If you look back, September of 2000, a group of neocon hawks, or members of the Project for a New American Century, many of whom became key officials in the Bush administration, wrote a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And their proposed plan was for a massive military buildup in the Middle East, but they said this would probably proceed quite slowly unless there was, in quotes, some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, it's interesting that they got their new Pearl Harbor on 9/11. The White House took full advantage of it and called 9/11 not just an act of terrorism, but an act of war, and immediately prepared to attack Afghanistan, even though most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. However, the Taliban, who were ruling Afghanistan at the time, offered to hand over Osama bin Laden to the U.S. right after 9/11, provided the White House could come up with solid evidence that Osama bin Laden was linked to 9/11. But the U.S., for some reason, refused to do so. But Secretary of State Colin Powell promised the UN and the world that he would provide a white paper with all the evidence, but he never did. Back in early 2001, the Bush administration held a series of negotiations with the Taliban, if you'll recall, to build a gas pipeline through Afghanistan. At one moment during the negotiations, U.S. representatives told the Taliban, either you accept our offer of a carpet of gold, or we bury you under a carpet of bombs. And that's exactly what happened to the Taliban. The coalition forces say that eventually they're going to pull out of Afghanistan, but according to CBS News and others, they will be leaving behind 700 military bases. To defend what, I ask? The pipeline? Or the people? Next part of the official story. And that multiple U.S. government intelligence failures were to blame. The evidence shows that these were deliberate failures. For example, in 2002, letter A, Colleen Rowley in 2002 was named one of Time Magazine's Whistleblowers of the Year. The reason? As a lawyer working for the FBI, she attempted to get a search warrant for Zacharias Moussaoui's laptop computer when it was seized just prior to 9/11. However, her attempts were thwarted by her boss, Robert Mueller, director of the FBI. Had she been able to get that warrant, she may have been able to prevent the so-called attacks, but she was blocked. Person B, Sibel Edmonds, the most gagged woman in U.S. history, testified before the 9/11 Commission about FBI message intercepts which revealed prior knowledge of 9/11, but wasn't allowed to testify. She was gagged instead. Michael J. Springman, who we've already mentioned, tried to testify in front of the 9/11 Commission about the Visas for Terrorists program, he's C, which was being run by the CIA out of Jeddah. He was ignored. Person D, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer of the Pentagon, testified that he he and others were told by the Bush White House to shut down their Able Danger operation, which was tracking 2 of the 3 9/11 terror cells, one of which was led by Mohammed Atta just prior to 9/11. Now, if, as the story goes, there was a massive intelligence, there was a massive intelligence failure on 9/11, then why were the following people promoted shortly afterwards instead of being reprimanded? Well, let's look at General Richard Myers, who was the acting Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman on 9/11, was promoted from Vice Chairman to Chairman 3 days after 9/11. He must have done a good job. Porter Goss, Representative Porter Goss, remember him, the Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, who met with the 9/11 money man in Washington on 9/11, was appointed to be the director of the CIA by President Bush 3 years later. Boy, he must have done a good job. And then Jane Garvey, head of the FAA, at the time of 9/11, that is, was chosen by presidential nominee John Kerry as an expert consultant in charge of security for the 2004 Democratic National Convention, 3 years after 9/11, despite her incompetence. And 4, Robert Mueller is still the director of the FBI, despite blocking Colleen Rowley and everyone else. There was Robert Wright, and there was Kenneth Williams as well. He blocked. Great job. The only reprimands I know of were aimed at 9/11 whistleblowers inside the FBI, CIA, and Pentagon, such as Colleen Rowley, who was named Whistleblower of the Year, along with 2 others, Sibel Edmonds, the most gagged woman in history, Tony Schaefer of Able Danger, and others who tried to stop the 9/11 plot. Now, if you remember, there was one other big intelligence failure that day, which happened in a small classroom in Sarasota, Florida. Do you remember what President Bush was doing the morning of 9/11 in the Booker Elementary classroom when he knew America was under attack? Even after White House Chief of Staff Andy Card told him a second plane had hit the second tower of the Twin Towers, Bush just sat there for another 7 or 8 minutes, can you believe it, discussing a story about a pet goat with grade 2 children.
Obviously, he knew something we don't. Otherwise, he and the Secret Service would have hightailed it out of there, in case the terrorists were to dive bomb the school. But no, he just sat there, as people in the Twin Towers were obviously trapped and dying by the hundreds, later claiming that he didn't want to scare the children. So as you can see, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to prove that 9/11 was radically different from what the U.S. government would have us believe. Even if a few of these anomalies were proven wrong, the pattern of lies, deceptions, and obfuscations still stands. As theologian David Ray Griffin, author of 9 books on 9/11, says, the only truth about the official story of 9/11 is that it is false, and we need a completely new investigation. However, there are many of us out there who can't get past the idea that the U.S. government would be involved in such a huge crime, that is, murdering 2,738 of their own citizens, plus 235 innocent people from other nations. Well, it may not have been the whole U.S. government. It may have been just a few criminal elements within the U.S. government who were involved. The obvious question is, how could they have gotten away with it without someone finding out and spilling the beans? Well, if it was a top-secret military operation, which seems likely, it would have been done with orders to take that secret to the grave. Plus, there are many whistleblowers, some of whom I have pointed out, but the mainstream media has covered up their eyewitness accounts. Why? Because the mainstream media is bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex. That we prove in issue 13 on pages 180 to 186. And the military-industrial complex is one of the main entities which has benefited the most from the resultant war on terror.